Hi guys, Melanie Grant here. This week we had a couple of questions as we're looking at our medicine and HCPC section in our CPT. I wanted to take a chance just to review one of the questions with you, looking at DTaP and polymyelitis vaccinations that are given to a 5-year-old, which is question number 3 from your chapter 26 practical chapter review questions. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here and we'll take a look at this together. So in your worksheet, we had here a DTaP with an oral poliomyelitis vaccine live administered to a 5-year-old patient. Additional information that actually goes into the E&M for history and exam are performed for an acute URI and medical decision-making that is straightforward. This is identified here because technically for the entire service, you would bill for both the E&M and the vaccination and administration. I went ahead and gave some answers to this one to help those of you out that had been looking at this and may have had some questions, since we have not yet covered our E&Ms in this class for this term. For right now, though, let's take a look at the DTaP and the poliomyelitis vaccine. Some of the questions that we had were pertaining directly to the Medicaid or the vaccine itself and how we administer it. And the fact that we had so many CPT codes for this. So something you should always be aware of when you're looking at your vaccines. There's always a code for the vaccine itself, and there is a code for the administration itself. And so when you have two vaccines here, that's two separate codes, one for each of the vaccines and two separate codes, one for each of the administrations. Your final code on this visit is the actual E&M itself, because an acute upper respiratory infection is unrelated to getting vaccines in the office today. Let's take a look at the answers for these and how we would have found these. If you looked at the answer key, you would have seen the evaluation and management visit for 99202-25. This goes into some of the detail in identifying the patient for the upper respiratory infection and the medical decision-making that was documented as straightforward. We will talk more about E&Ms later on as we cover that section in section 2 of our class. So for now, if you attempted this and you got it, give yourself a congratulations. If you didn't, that's okay. We will focus on that later on. We can see in the answer key the vaccine for the diphtheria, tetanus, axillar pertussis, or DTaP is 90749. And for the polio, it's actually an unlisted code. And so oftentimes I hear coders say, well, how would I have gotten to that when looking in my CPT book? So the first thing you want to look at is the term vaccination or inoculation, which will take you to vaccination, in the back of your CPT code book. I always tell people to think of a couple of different terms as you're looking at the codes themselves, because sometimes the wrong term will have a reference directing you to where you'll actually find it categorized. So I'm going to flip in my book here, and I'll stop sharing here and show you as I go through the book exactly where you would be looking. So let's take a look at this together. Don't mind me as we get connected with the camera here. Okay, so we have here at the bottom of page 1184 of our CPT code book, where we can see vaccines and toxoids. I'm trying to get that a little bit focused in. There we go. Under vaccines and toxoids, you'll look the vaccine up by its name directly. You'll see here that the Tdap and DTaP are both listed with a couple of different options. And so you'll want to take your time to go through all of the different options in here. At the end of the day, the code for 90749 is going to be found by going directly to the vaccination section. And so when you come to a section in your CPT index where you're looking in the alphabetical and it does not list everything, you'll want to say, okay, well, where are the vaccines listed? Because we can see that there is diphtheria, tetanus, exceller, pertussis, and inactivated polio virus, which is 90696. And it's very easy to pick that one up accidentally. But if you see below here, the diphtheria, tetanus, exceller, pertussis, referred to as DTaP or TDAP, has a code range of 90700 and 90715. If the patient had also had the Hep B and IPV, you would look at separate codes. Inactivated polio with Hib and Hep B, you would have a listed code. And so on and so forth. There's a lot of different codes here. So that can be really confusing. And what I say when I see that is always look to see, well, what section is this in? And it's in the 90700s. And so that's where I would go in my tabular is to 90700 and look at the actual section of the CPT book. Further back. And so when you're coming into the CPT book, it's important to identify where your vaccines are actually starting. And so you can look at the main header to see what section we are in. In 904, we have the immunization administration for vaccine toxoids. So that's the admin code that will be next. On page 699, we have the header for vaccines and toxoids. And we have numerous in-section guidelines. I'm trying to get that without the shadow on the light. Sorry for that. So we can see that there are numerous in-section guidelines. It's important to look through these and see what they're referencing. So the first guidelines are talking to us about assistance that we can use from the AMA to identify new and revised vaccine information as it's provided. This is especially important this year in a year of COVID because vaccines will be developed and they're expecting some of these to change. Sorry for the camera movement, guys. The next thing is talking about recognition of information on where you can find details from the FDA. And then in the third paragraph, we can see codes for 90476 through 904-749 identify the vaccine product only. This is giving you information about that additional code for the administration. And so you would want to read through this and you would say, oh, aha, I have additional codes that I must report. And this gives us information on that. The next paragraph down starts if it's significantly separate identifiable evaluation and management service is performed, that would be reported separately. And so that would identify that E&M for the upper respiratory infection. And then we have information talking about the immunization registries, vaccine distribution programs. And so we didn't have anything about that from this patient, so I would keep reading. And then the last paragraph on the bottom of column 1 says, when administered to, age descriptions included in the vaccine are not intended to identify a product's licensed age. And so this is just information telling us that the code age and the product age may be different. The next column continues with in-section guidelines talking to us about combination vaccines and how it is inappropriate to list each component separately. So what this is identifying to us is that if the patient has a DTaP with a combination of a live polio vaccine, as we gave them today, we would identify one code for that. And so we must look through all those combinations. There is a vaccine abbreviation listed in codes 90476 through 748. And this is giving us information on where we can find those abbreviations. After that, we begin the vaccines based off of alphabetical name. And so to find the DTaP, I would simply go alphabetically. And I would see, of course, that there's some codes out of sequence. And I would see that there is no D. So we go from, well, there is a D, there's dengue from 90587, and then we start with our H's. And so I would continue going until I can find the correct codes for the DTaP. And so you'll see there's several different influenzas depending on the variant. And at the top of page 702, you'll come up to your first DTaP combination code, which is for diphtheria, tetanus, toxoids, excelliar, pertussis vaccine, and inactivated poliovirus. And so we don't want that one. Continuing on, the next one also has additional vaccines that were not given. And so we do not want that combination code. When we come to 90700, which is actually the code we will select, we see for DTaP, when it administered to individuals younger than 7 years of age, intramuscular use. And so this one would appear to be the correct code. I would, of course, want to verify that this was, in fact, a patient age 7 and younger, or younger than 7, so 6, almost 7 and younger. And I would also want to verify that it was intramuscular use. And so if you don't have that information in your documentation, you would want to query the provider, or in this case, your instructor, for information. Now, because we did have the live version of the polio and that was included in some of the combinations, before I would be confident with that as my code, I would want to read through all of my additional DTaP combinations. And so we had the DTaP with polio that was inactivated and a couple of examples with additional vaccines. The next one after the one we selected without a combination is just simply the diphtheria and tetanus. And so that would not be accurate to report. And then we go into the measles, mumps, and rubella. So we would continue on. We do have a code here on 90713 for the polio virus inactivated for subcutaneous or intramuscular use. Now, since our code is not inactivated, that would not be correct, and we would want to continue reading. And continue reading. We have a TDAP, which is simply very similar to the DTaP. You'll notice all of the abbreviations and identify the same vaccines. However, this is for individuals 7 and older. And so they changed the terminology there. And so at this point, as a coder, you would want to continue reading through. There is an additional DTaP here. However, this is not accurate for our patient as it's with Hep B and inactivated polio. And we continue down the line all the way through all of our vaccine codes. And again, I apologize for the shadows there. So at the end of the day, your final code is an unlisted vaccine or toxoid. And that's 90749, and the appropriate code to list for your polio vaccine. We identify this because we've gone through the entire vaccination list and made sure that all of the codes selected are accurate. After we've selected both of the code for our DTaP and our polio vaccine, we want to go over to our immunization or administration for vaccines and toxoids. We know that we needed to go here because when we started in the vaccines and toxoids, there were in-section guidelines from page 699 that told us to use additional codes for the vaccine administration from codes 90460, 90461, 90471, 90472, 90473, and 90474. These are the codes that we would reference when selecting the correct vaccine administration. We know that we have a patient that had an oral vaccine and that had the DTaP, which wasn't necessarily identified as intramuscular or another route. However, they did indicate to us the separate vaccine that was oral versus non-oral. And the code that we selected for the DTaP is only available intramuscular. We could verify that with our provider if we had any questions. So I would want to find an administration for an oral vaccination as well as the intramuscular. And we typically go in the order that it's given. So the DTaP was listed first. So we would want to find the administration code for the DTaP, which was intramuscular. Read through your in-section guidelines. This gives us information on what codes to list the administration with. This is very important because many coders will get confused with administration codes for vaccines versus administration for drugs. This gives us guidelines on 90460 and 90461, which I've had some questions this week about. These two codes are for use with children ages under 18 years of age to report when there's documentation of counseling and professional face-to-face services during the administration of the vaccination. If this is not indicated in your visit documentation, you would not use those codes even though the patient is under 18 years of age. There's additional guidelines which are new this year, as indicated by the arrows and the green writing, identifying when to use a separate identifiable evaluation and management service. And then the last section, in-section guideline, tells us to a component refers to all antigens in a vaccine that prevent disease caused by one organism. Multivalent antigens or multi-serotypes of antigens against a single organism are considered a single component of vaccines. And so this is basically telling us, because we report each administration per component. And so this is some guidelines to identify how those apply. We know that our patient did not have documented coordination of counseling by the provider, even though they're under 18 years of age. And so 90460 and the add-on 90461 would not be used. 90471 is the first vaccine administration we'll come to, which identifies immunization administration, including percutaneous, intradermal, subcutaneous, or intramuscular injections. And so this is basically every type of vaccine injection that is performed for the first one vaccine, single or combo. And at 90472, we have an indented code, which says each additional vaccine. So the first thing to identify is our initial immunization. 90471 would apply for the DTaP. Since this is a primary procedure, add-on codes must be listed with a primary in order to list each additional procedure. When I get to 90473, immunization administration by intranasal or oral route, this would be the correct type of vaccine to give for the polio vaccination, since it was in fact oral. However, the definition of 90473 reads immunization administration by intranasal or oral route, one vaccine. We know this patient had more than one vaccine, so we would want to read down to 90474, which reads first by looking at the standalone code or parent code to this indented code. So I would read 90473 up to the semicolon. Immunization administration by intranasal or oral route, each additional vaccine. Single or combination vaccine toxoid lists separately in addition to the code for the primary procedure. At this point, I would also want to verify at the bottom of 90474, since it is a plus, meaning it's an add-on code, to see if I could list this with 90471 as the primary? I can. And so I would list 90471 as the first administration for my DTaP vaccine and 90474 as the secondary administration for my polio vaccine. If you listed these in opposite orders, where you listed your primary as the polio and the add-on for the 90472 instead, that would not necessarily be incorrect. You could list either order. However, the provider listed it in order of the DTaP first, and that's why we list that primary. That's all I have for this one. Forgive me for our movable webcam as we discover how to code with CPT coding. If you have questions, feel free to send me an email. And don't forget, our coding clinics start in week 3 on Tuesday evenings from 5:30 to 7 at the time of this recording. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.